Good afternoon. I think we'll get started. A couple more people might filter in. Welcome. My name is Rick Vandenberg, and I'm a professor in the Grossman School of Business here at the University of Vermont, and also current faculty director of the Janus Forum. So before we begin on our debate for today, I just want to say a couple things about the Janus Forum. The whole idea is that the Janus Forum is dedicated to this idea of constructive debate about important policy issues, important issues of the day. Our primary mission is to sort of look at ideas and look at issues from either a solution that's a centralized government approach or a decentralized individual approach. That's how we typically have debates at the Janus Forum. But most important, we're encouraging open debate, constructive debate, and trying to avoid a lot of ad hominem attacks and the type of debate that you see on TV if you're tuning into that stuff these days. So we've been very successful at that. Today we're holding a really timely and topical debate on whether we should restrict speech on campus. Before we begin, I want to say thank you to a bunch of people. This will only take about 30 minutes. No, I'm joking. But the Janus Forum is run by a group of faculty on campus, so let me just briefly say thank you to them. Caroline Beer in political science, Erin Kinsvatter in the College of Education and Social Services, Chris Kaliba, Community Development and Applied Economics, Don Loeb in philosophy, Kurt Ventris in the Rubenstein School of Natural Resources, and Art Wolf in the Department of Economics. Last year, we also began a very exciting partnership with students from the Lawrence Debate Union and faculty from the Lawrence Debate Union. So I want to thank Miranda Ziegler, Lily Oates, Sarah Anders, and Professor Helen Morgan Parmit for their hard work to help put together this event. Also, several people, some in the audience, have made it possible to hold this event today. First, we are very grateful to the Pizza Galley and Hilton families for their generosity. Their support has made it possible to sustain the Janus Forum into the future. Second, many thanks to the Institute for Humane Studies at George Mason University. They provided funding to support today's event. Also, I want to say thank you to the President's Office as well as the Foundation for their ongoing support for the Janus Forum. Finally, an event like this doesn't happen without a lot of help behind the scenes, so thank you very much to Linda Kruger, Jen O'Donnell, Nick Gingro, John Turner, and others from the Grossman School of Business. So before we begin, let me just make two final comments. There's a reception afterwards, so please join us for a reception if you have time. And second and finally, it's my pleasure to introduce Art Wolf. Art is a UVM professor in the economics department, and he's serving as the moderator for today's event. So Art will introduce our speakers and talk about the format. Art, thank you.
Thank you, Rick, and thank you all for coming. Controversies over free speech are as old as our republic. In 1798, Vermont Congressman Matthew Lyons was found guilty and imprisoned for violating the Sedition Act, which outlawed malicious speech about the U.S. government. Lyons handily won re-election while in prison, the only member of Congress ever to do so. I won't have any other editorial comments about that. The right to speak freely was enshrined in the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, but more than 200 years later, the issue is still controversial. Whether it's a Nazi parade on a street, robed Ku Klux Klan members at a rally, hateful sentences in a newspaper or on radio, or words in a campus lecture. What is acceptable, what is allowed, and what is necessary can and does cause tremendous controversy. Recently, that controversy has spilled over into many campuses, including Yale, Berkeley, Oberlin, Evergreen State, and closer to home, Middlebury, which all have had widely publicized incidents. What should outside speakers, students, and professors be allowed to say on campus? Anything and everything? or should specific words and indeed specific ideas be constrained on campus? Today, we bring two distinguished speakers to campus to investigate and discuss this issue. David Shea is an associate professor of English at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire, where he teaches courses in Asian literature, Asian American literature, critical studies, and rhetoric. He is currently writing a book on how contemporary practices of racist storytelling shape public policy and maintain the racial status quo. He blogs on issues of race and racism in popular culture at Stanford University's Digital Humanities Salon titled Arcade. Jonathan Rauch is a journalist currently at the Brookings Institution and is a contributing editor at The Atlantic magazine. Before that, he wrote for several newspapers and magazines, including The Economist. He writes on a variety of issues, including politics, American government, psychology, business, business and economics, and social issues. A few years ago, he revised a book he wrote 2 decades earlier titled Kindly Inquisitors, The New Attacks on Free Thought, which dealt with the very issue we are discussing today. Our format today is for each speaker to give a 15-minute statement on their views. Then each will have 10 minutes to respond to the other. The remainder of the time will be devoted to questions from the audience. The speakers flipped a coin to see who went first, and Jonathan won, so he will be speaking first. Jonathan Rauch.
Thank you so much, everybody. I'm now doing the obligatory sound check. As speakers have said down throughout history, from the time of Demosthenes on, is this on? Can you hear me? It is such an honor to be here today. Thank you, Art, Aaron, Rick, and a special thanks to Professor Shea for appearing here with me, and to all of you for coming out on this wonderful day. I was born in 1960, started my career as a writer, thinker, and journalist in the 80s, and fairly early in that career became an advocate of two things. One was gay equality, and the other was freedom of thought, freedom of speech, freedom of conscience. Those two things both occurred in my life at about the same time, and to me they're deeply linked. And I thought, since we'll have a good deal of time for questions and discussion to get in particular issues, I might start out today by telling a story that tells you something about where I'm coming from and where I think some other people who look at the world the way I do are coming from. Begin by maybe setting some parameters. Those who are here looking for a hammer and tongs debate between an absolute libertarian advocate of complete free speech in all circumstances, including yelling fire in a crowded theater, will be disappointed, because that's not what I'm here for. And I doubt that Professor Shea is going to argue for totalitarian centralized control of speech. I think what we probably will be talking about is where the two of us fall on the fairly wide spectrum in between, and why we make the particular choices and trade-offs that we make, and how we think about this to maybe help guide some of you in how you think about it, because these cases on college campuses and off college campuses are in fact not easy in many situations. I was born in 1960. Grew up in the 60s and 70s. At the time when I was born, and well into my teenage years, it was illegal for homosexual Americans to work for the federal government. That didn't change until I was 15. Couldn't get security clearances until I was in my mid-30s. Until 2003, when I was 43 years old, we were menaced with arrest in our own homes for the crime of loving someone. And that's just the beginning. We were terrorized, beaten on the streets, not uncommonly beaten to death. We were denounced from the pulpits. We were treated, literally, as disordered by the psychiatric establishment, and sometimes treated against our will, condemned as insane. I could go on and on. Yet today, 2018, I am married and have been now for 10 years to a man in the United States of America. And that marriage has been recognized nationally for a couple years now. This is a revolution in my lifetime, and frankly, ladies and gentlemen, not one that I ever expected to see. When I first started writing in favor of same-sex marriage in 1995, my father begged me not to do it. Not because he was homophobic, but because he said, this is such a crazy, insane, lunatic idea. I mean, a man marrying a man, that he said I would discredit myself from having a serious career in journalism forever after. And friends, that was a realistic possibility in 1995. So what changes that brings America from being a society that is literally steeped in institutionalized and often personal hatred of gay people to where we are today? A situation where our problems are not entirely resolved, but it's night and day difference. In the early 1950s, a magazine is founded in Los Angeles called One, O-N-E magazine. It's the first gay intellectual magazine. It's not pornographic. It publishes poetry and essays, including essays advocating same-sex marriage, and essays criticizing the federal government for its practices of censoring publications like One, which were deemed obscene under the standards of the time. Sure enough, when they published an issue that had as its cover story, "You Can't Say That," a criticism of government censorship, the US Postmaster General declared it obscene and banned it from the US mails, banned the magazine from the US mails. This is pre-internet. There was no way to distribute a magazine except through the US mail, except to people you could personally hand it to. So the government had banned that magazine. The magazine went to the Supreme Court. It lost in district court, which said, don't be ridiculous, your magazine is obscene and antisocial. The district court was upheld on appeal. At the Supreme Court, in January of 1958, the Supreme Court issued a per curiam decision, meaning just a single sentence to which all 9 justices signed on, affirming the right of One magazine to publish. That's all it said. Overturn the lower courts. That, I would suggest, is the critical moment in gay rights history in America, because that is the moment when we, homosexual Americans, got our voice. For the first time, without fear of government censorship, we could speak. Coincidentally, at the same time, January of 1958, a man named Frank Kameny was fired from his government job from being gay. He was a scientist who worked for the US Army Map Service. Most people who were fired for being gay went out and crawled under a rock because of shame and stigma. Sometimes they committed suicide, but Kameny did not. He appealed his firing to the US Civil Service Commission and lost, to the US Congress and lost. He filed a Supreme Court brief. The Supreme Court refused to hear his case. He never was rehired by the federal government, though in 2010 he received a formal apology from the US government for firing him, and that apology was delivered by the head of the agency that fired him, who was, in 2010, wait for it, openly gay. Kameny lived to see that revolution happen. He went on to be the first gay person to run for Congress, the first gay person to picket the White House. He was instrumental in overturning the American Psychiatric Association's definition of gay people as insane. Seminal figure in gay rights history. You all, of course, have never heard of him, with 1 or 2 exceptions. Someday he will be as famous as he deserves to be. But I want to bring up something specific about him, which is kind of why I'm here today. So Kameny filed this Supreme Court brief, and he said a lot in it, but there's a couple of sentences I want to read you. The brief is in print, by the way. You can get it on Google Kindle format. It's amazing. It's visionary that these words were written in 1961. Here's what he said. He was a combat veteran of World War II. He saw heavy action in Europe. He told the Supreme Court, in World War II, petitioner did not hesitate to fight the Germans with bullets in order to help preserve his rights and freedoms and liberties and those of others. In 1960, it is ironically necessary that he fight the Americans with words in order to preserve against a tyrannical government some of those same rights, freedoms, and liberties for himself and others. Notice what he's saying here. He's, first of all, fighting for the freedom of everyone, not just himself. He says that twice, for himself and others. It's not just gay rights, freedom for all Americans. But second, he's fighting with words. He understands the power of words. And he's right. How do we get from that world to this world? I can tell you it's not because gay people had large political organizations, lots of money and power and support in high places. Of course, none of those things were true. We were pariahs mostly living underground. But it's because some people like Frank Kameny, and then some people like Andrew Sullivan, and maybe even people like me, and lots of other people used our voices and used them effectively. And here's what we learn. In the short run, important new ideas, social ideas, are always rejected as obscene or subversive or dangerous. In the medium run, if you're out there day after day making your case, people start to listen. And in the longer run, if you're right, not always, but usually, you prevail. One of the ways you prevail is that the other side is out there trying to argue against you, sometimes doing what we call hate speech, sometimes doing what sounds like reasoned speech, but is just wrong and misguided. What Kameny understood is that every time someone with a bad or bogus idea gets out there, that is an opportunity for people like me to come forward and say, no, that's wrong. Here's what's right. Every time they talk about hate and show how hateful they are, that's an opportunity for us to counter with a narrative of love. They talked about homosexuals seducing children and undermining national security and destroying the institution of family. We talked about homosexuals building community, building marriages, caring for kids, giving back, and finding a destination for our love. Amazingly, but maybe not so amazingly, we win that battle. Frank Kameny was never someone to back down from an argument. I heard him at it. I once heard him confront a staff member of the Family Research Council, which is a very, very anti-gay group. And he said, I'm going to do this without the microphone, because otherwise it will bring the chandeliers down. But this is how Frank Kameny sounded. If your God condemns people like me, then you worship a false and bigoted God. That is how he sounded. He was often compared to a foghorn, to the advantage of the foghorn. So he never backed down from an argument, but never once in his long career, he died in 2011, did he urge that anyone else be silenced or censored, because he understood that hate speech is an opportunity for truth to shine. And I have found that to be true in my career as well. Same-sex marriage went from ridiculous to thought-provoking to the law of the land because we were able to speak. I'll never forget, I did a book on same-sex marriage in 2004. I was appearing on a radio show with an opponent of same-sex marriage, and someone called up to the show and said to the host, your guest today may be the most dangerous man in America. He's talking about me. And the host said, why? And the guy said, because he's making it all sound so reasonable. That's when I knew that this was a fight that we could win. Here's the truth about hate speech, if you can agree what it is. One man's hate speech is another person's, say, Catholic doctrine. Minorities benefit from a society that protects hate speech far more than they benefit from a society that protects minorities from hate speech. Please do not protect me from people who make homophobic and bigoted statements. I will not melt. Gay people spent 2 decades overthrowing the stereotype that we were weak, that we were pansies and limp wrists, that we couldn't take it. I hear there's a bias incident reporting system on this campus. Is that right? Some of you may be surprised, given where I'm coming from as a free speech advocate, that I have a bias incident reporting system that I support, but it may not be the one you have. My bias incident reporting system is, if you're biased against me, report it to me. And I will engage with you. And if I don't persuade you, then I'll persuade some of the people who are listening. But for God's sake, please don't try to protect me from hostile ideas. There's a more fundamental point about this, which is people who want to restrict speech on campus in deference to the sensibilities of minority people to try to protect us don't understand where hate comes from. Most Americans, unless they happen to be sociopaths, do not get up every morning and say, who can I hate on today? Whose life can I make miserable? Where hate comes from is ignorance and fear. People thought gay people were out to seduce their children, undermine the family, and undermine the US government. Well, if you thought I was going to seduce your children, undermine the family, and corrupt the US government, you would hate me too. The way you attack hate and prejudice and bigotry is with better ideas and information, and that means everybody needs to be able to talk to get these ideas out there. I need to know where this hate is so that I need to know who I'm talking to. And fundamentally, you cannot get rid of hate by suppressing it. In fact, you just make martyrs of the people that you're trying to suppress. Or if their name is Milo Yiannopoulos, you give them multi-million-dollar book and speaking contracts because everywhere they go, they attract so much attention. That's not a good model. The best speech code on a college campus for people with haters or bad ideas is if they're reachable, you try to correct them. If they're not reachable, you try to ignore them. But always remember, minorities don't need to be sheltered from bad ideas. Minorities, above all, benefit from a society where we can speak. At the end of the day, in a majoritarian society, speech codes will be used against minorities, not for minorities. We've learned that again and again when Canada adopted speech codes. The first thing the authorities went after in Ontario was a lesbian bookstore. Happens again and again. That's, for all of those reasons, I think that's, in society, it's very important that we allow debate to flourish for the good of minorities, and it's especially important in a campus environment. Campuses are places that are dedicated to learning, to the advancement of ideas, to the development of the critical faculty, and all of that requires that we get out of our safe spaces intellectually every day. Of course, no violence, no direct physical threats or attacks. But intellectually, if we're in our safe spaces, we're not learning. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Our next speaker, if you haven't guessed, is David Shea.
Oh, thanks, Rick. Good afternoon. My name is David Shea. Like Jonathan, I want to say how much of an honor it is to be invited to speak to you today as part of the Janus Forum. I want to thank all of the members of the Janus Forum for the invitation. I want to thank Art and Rick and Aaron, and especially Jonathan, for sharing the floor with me today. I'm really glad that Jonathan talked about this not being a very kind of doctrinaire type of debate between absolute free speech and speech regulations, because that's not what I wanted to talk to you today about. I wanted to bring a little bit of nuance to the debate by talking about American exceptionalism. Jonathan had talked about other Western democracies instituting speech codes. He talked about Canada and lots of Western democracies in Europe have these regulations against hate speech that the United States doesn't have, partly because of its own exceptional identity and roots in free speech. But I also wanted to talk about something else that makes America exceptional, which is its history of race, and why, in my opinion, race is an exception to the conversations that we have about free speech, particularly through a metaphor that I think maybe a lot of you are familiar with, which is the marketplace of ideas, which is this, this space where ideas struggle for truth. The bad ones fall away or burned away, and what remains is truth to be enshrined as knowledge. And so this is a very common metaphor for talking about free speech. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about the role that race plays in it. This is my claim, that the marketplace of ideas paradigm does not change the racial status quo. It's about as simply as I could put it. So hate speech is therefore not a means to a truthful end. It may just be the end. And I'll talk about two reasons why I believe this, give you some examples from it. The first is that when it comes to ideas about race in the market, Americans are less rational consumers because of their personal experiences or their absence of them. I'm an English professor, and contrary to what a lot of people might think about what it means to teach literature and to teach English, what I do is that I teach my students how meaning is made. It's not to teach them this particular novel or this particular poem. It's to teach them how meaning is made. And so ideas don't exist in a vacuum on their own. There's something I say to all of my students, which is that, that a story doesn't mean anything until it's read. And that what you should be interpreting is your reading of that story, not the book that you're holding in your hands. The second point I want to make here, one reason why the marketplace of ideas fails when it comes to race, is that white Americans already own a perceived interest in some ideas about race. I think the marketplace of ideas is already familiar with the reality that some people are going to have vested interests in some ideas. These might be moral interests. They might be pecuniary interests. And that's fine. I think that this metaphor controls for that. But what I'm here to tell you today is that the interest that white Americans can have about race and racial issues is relative to the interest that people of color have in those ideas. That's the difference that race has, and particularly black people, that it's relative. It's almost inversely proportional. And so the value is already kind of baked into these ideas before they're even debated. So I'm going to give you some examples of this. I know that you can't see this very well, but this is a poster that appeared on my campus about 5 years ago, and it appeared in a residence hall. My campus is about as large as your campus, about 10,000 students. And so this is one of the largest residence halls. On one floor, you had a community, a living community on this floor, and it was called the Hmong Living Community. And if you're not familiar with Hmong Americans, these are Asian Americans, most of whom, my students at least, were born in this country, but many of their parents were refugees from Laos after the Vietnam War. So half of the floor of this residence hall was for the Hmong learning community. And you didn't have to be Hmong to be part of this learning community. It just so happened that I believe all of the students were Hmong who were part of this learning community. And then the other wing on this floor were students who just wanted to live in a res hall and didn't even know that they would be sharing the floor with the Hmong learning community. And my university is about 90% white. The student body is about 90% white. So I would imagine that the demographics of the other half of the floor kind of fell along those lines. So a number of posters appeared in November of 2012 on this floor. This is really the only one that has survived, the only one that there's a picture of. And so I know that you probably can't read the poster, so I transcribed some of the comments from this poster over here on the right. And you know, as Jonathan was saying, for some of you these might seem just like rude comments, and for some of you they might seem like microaggressions, and then for others it might seem like hate speech. So I'll just let you take a look at these on your own and kind of make your own decision about how you would categorize them. You have meetings for Hmong only. You take Hmong pictures at wing events. Do you see us whites taking American pictures? No. You make your stinky food on our floor. Yuck. You are ridiculously loud and never get yelled at. We get yelled at before quiet hours. Oh, and you don't even try to talk to us. And so the title of this poster was Problems with This Floor. Now, since we're talking about ideas, and we're talking about the ideas behind hate speech and anti-racist speech, I did my best. You can kind of decide how well I did. The insults themselves are not the ideas, right? The insults themselves are premised on ideas. And so I did my best to come up with these premises that would lead to these insults. You can decide for yourself how close I came. So, you know, the one about Hmong-only meetings should not be segregated by race. The one about pictures, calling attention to racial group-based identity is wrong. Also, the next one was kind of a gimme, white equals American. The one about food, people living in the same space should respect the comfort of others. The one about being loud, no one group should get special treatment from the institution. And then, you know, the one about talking, everyone regardless of race shares the same level of responsibility for getting along. So when you have a discussion about microaggressions or hate speech, these are the ideas that I think we have a discussion about. We don't have a discussion about the actual insults, right? Because they're based on these much deeper assumptions and beliefs. So Student Affairs asked a couple of faculty members to come talk to the floor, all the students living on this floor, about this one poster. I was included, and we were supposed to talk about it and its implications, why students were very hurt by it, the implications of this poster. And we actually convened a town hall kind of meeting. It was in a room that was probably a little bit larger than this one. So the students who lived on this floor, other interested students, faculty and staff, and my colleague and I did our best to talk about these ideas, to engage in a kind of reasoned debate over them. And you know, the question I have up here is, did the event lead to agreement about the knowledge that was true? And my answer is not really. And I think you can kind of tell already why the deck was stacked against us, that it was very difficult, I think, for the students to respond to what we were saying, given that we were authoritative faculty members. And I think in many ways, the students had already made up their minds about what the meaning of those insults were. And so I'm here to tell you today about where those meanings came from. And so getting back to my first point, when it comes to ideas about race, Americans are less rational consumers because of their personal experiences or the absence of them. And I've got a cover of a book here of one of your esteemed faculty members, I believe, Dr. James Lowen, and he wrote a book called Sundown Towns. I don't know how many of you have read this book. But if you're not familiar with a sundown town is a community that has decided that there aren't going to be any black people in it. That black people can work in it during the day, but when the sun goes down, you have to leave. And believe it or not, there are a lot of sundown towns in Wisconsin. There's a lot of sundown towns in the upper Midwest. Dr. Lowen's thesis is that racism was actually worse in the Midwest than it was in the South because of this kind of cleansing. So here are just some images of some news stories, some of them quite recent. The DOJ sued a community in Wisconsin in 2011. Some of these have to do with more affluent suburbs in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. So where do your experiences come from? Like, where do your assumptions come from? When you make meaning of these ideas that are behind those insults in the poster, how much do your personal experiences have to do with them? And what does it mean when the state steps in to create those meanings for you, to create those assumptions for you by engineering communities like this one, or like these? This is a new book by Richard Rothstein called The Color of Law. And so, you know, while the sundown towns happened at state and local and regional levels, Rothstein's book talks about federal policy that actually segregated, in most of the pieces that he's talking about, black Americans from white Americans. And so many of you may know about these racially exclusive communities like Levittown, a lot of these projects in cities like Detroit and Chicago were federally run, or federally directed. This is kind of a redlining map from the city of Milwaukee, which, if you didn't know, Wisconsin in many ways is one of the worst states in the country to be black, based on a number of metrics. This is a quotation from Ryan Enos, and he's a professor at Harvard in government, and this is just an excerpt from an article that he wrote for Vox. And he studies this thing called spatial geography, and he came up with a really interesting theory here. And he said that it's not just that you develop racist attitudes toward a particular group because you're segregated from them. You actually have to be kind of close to them, but still segregated from them in order to develop those kind of animosities. So he says that it's the presence of a group that's proximate, yet segregated, close but far, that precipitates the politics of division. And so this certainly describes the communities that exist in Wisconsin, where I live, and maybe where you live and grew up as well. It's something definitely worth investigating. So, you know, I'm just trying to tie these points back to the poster that I showed you in the beginning. And so these experiences that students have or don't have based on the segregation in their communities does have an effect on the meaning of the ideas that are presented in that poster, right? These are the ones that I felt as though might be impacted from not having very diverse experiences or being segregated from a community, yet being close to them. So you might be wondering, isn't this evidence of the marketplace of ideas in action? That is, we don't know, you know, we know all of these different things now about the ways that segregation has worked in this country to separate people of different races. Isn't it better now that we know all these things about spatial geography and sundown towns? Isn't that the marketplace of ideas in action? Doesn't this kind of advance the argument for racial integration more than ever? And I would say generally, yeah, you know, that I think that what Jonathan was talking about with marriage equality, absolutely, these ideas advance this, this knowledge to the point where we have changes in social policy. But race is different, as I've been saying. And this is the reason why. My second reason, that white Americans already own a perceived interest in some ideas about race. And that interest is relative to the interest that people of color have. So they don't kind of exist on their own. There was research done here in 2011 that basically believed that white people see kind of their status in the country as a kind of zero-sum game vis-a-vis people of color. And if this is an unfamiliar idea to you, it's a very old idea. That is, if this person of color gets something, then I must have something being taken away from me, right? And this is one reason why the marketplace of ideas doesn't work so well for race, because as I said, this interest is already baked into some of the ideas. Carol Anderson, who wrote a book that I would recommend to anybody entitled White Rage, says this very succinctly, that, and white rage is something that she describes as a kind of backlash to black racial progress in the country. But it doesn't necessarily happen in the streets in a violent way. It happens through policy. So she says the trigger for it is black advancement. There's a trigger for racism isn't just pure hatred. It's the perception that black people are advancing in society and taking things away from white people. So here's some examples that would speak to this kind of resentment. You know, we have black codes, we have the GI Bill, we have Milliken versus Bradley, which eliminated busing. We have Shelby versus Holder. We have Alan Bakke here, and affirmative action. So I'd be happy to talk about these during the Q&A session. So, you know, these are the kind of ideas that might be associated with something being taken away from you. That somebody's getting something that you're not getting. And when that happens, you know, the feeling that you're entitled to that thing or somebody's getting special treatment gets invoked. So my conclusion is that hate speech has no instrumental function toward advancing knowledge in a marketplace of ideas because of the presumption of an autonomous, rational consumer of ideas about race. Through the legacy of de jure segregation, the state has already regulated the marketplace to favor the racial status quo. And faith in a marketplace of ideas solution subjects racial minorities to abuse in the name of a glacial march of progress that actually is set back quite often through these instances that I was showing you. And I know this is a kind of a wall of text, but I know that we were wanting to have a conversation about what to do then, because Jonathan and I agree on the importance of free speech and very limited, and probably Jonathan believes more limited regulations on speech than I do, but generally I believe in the open, free expression that we already experience on campus. But I want us to think a little bit differently. What does it mean to move beyond the marketplace of ideas as a way to produce knowledge of racial issues? That is, why are we tied to this idea that knowledge is produced only through the exchange of expression? Can we think about other ways that knowledge is produced? Many anti-racist faculty, staff, and students see hate speech as both speech and act. This is where the problem lies. This is where the conflict lies. Somebody says, no, you've actually harmed me with an act, with your speech. And then somebody who just said it said, no, I just said something to you. So they see calls for civility in town hall meetings as just speech. How can the state promote a consonance of speech and action for them? Can knowledge come from elsewhere besides only the ritual exchange of expression? Might societal change come from the knowledge gained through the ritual exchange of experience in protected environments? That is, you can come to know something not just by talking and debating about it, but by experiencing something with somebody else. And then what might be the responsibility of the public university for protecting such a right in the same way it vigilantly protects free speech? Thank you.
Thank you. We now are going to give each speaker 10 minutes to comment on the other speaker's views or anything they want. John?
Thank you, Professor Shea. In a way, this is, I've done a number of such conversations and debates, and in one respect, at least, this gets to fundamentals faster and better, I think, than any other. Many of these conversations about free speech almost immediately devolve into what does the First Amendment say and what happened in case X, Y, and Z. And what's so refreshing about your presentation is that it goes to the fundamentals, much lower in society, about why we care about free expression, what its limits are, and really the, I think, epistemological challenge, would that be fair, that you've laid out here, which is, I think what you're really asking here in the question 1 above there is, where does knowledge come from? And might there be routes to knowledge that don't involve the exchange of words through the so-called marketplace of ideas? I call it the marketplace of persuasion, which is what it really is. And are there alternative routes to knowledge? So now, ladies and gentlemen, we're getting into very deep waters. And frankly, we're in well over my head. But we are asking the right question, and we're asking the right question in a university. Where does social knowledge come from? And where does moral knowledge come from? And I'm going to stake some ground here. I'm not going to say the exchange of propositions in public debate is the absolutely only place knowledge comes from. There's other kinds of knowledge. There's recipe knowledge, like how do you make a baked Alaska? That's probably not something that we're going to see scientific journals in university departments going after each other on. But when we talk about knowledge of the external world, I'm going to say there is no functional alternative to what we call metaphorically the marketplace of ideas. So I wrote a book about this. It's called Kindly Inquisitors, the new attacks on free thought. You can get it for $12.99 on Amazon. revised with a new afterword and a new foreword, advertisement, mandatory for authors. And it's about the social creation of knowledge. And I don't believe you'll find the phrase marketplace of ideas anywhere in it. Here's what I think is really going on where knowledge comes from. This is what the whole book is about. I call it liberal science, for lack of a better term. It is an international, a global system of criticism in which people float ideas, good and bad, well expressed and poorly expressed, and other people try to knock them down. It's a global network of people looking for other people's mistakes. The great advantage of liberal science, which includes, it's not just the hard sciences, it's the soft sciences, and it's also the media, it's journalism. It's the whole global search for truth. The great advantage of this is not that it's efficient and not that it's kind. It's neither of the above. It's wasteful and often non-compassionate. But it's that it makes its mistakes extremely fast. If you're a frog and you have a false hypothesis about whether you can eat flies for dinner, you're going to die, and it will take many generations of frogs for evolution to teach frogs that that hypothesis is wrong. Art Wolf, by contrast, can float a hypothesis about the economy and be proven wrong by fellow economists within a week, and I guarantee that that has happened to him often. Sorry, Art. Sometimes daily. This system of liberal science is extraordinary at finding error, but in order to find error, you have to expose proposition to criticisms, and in order to do that, you have to state them as propositions. Something I loved about Professor Shea's presentation is the way he translated these sort of really inchoate, immature statements that students made into something resembling debatable propositions. And I think that's the right thing to do, actually. That's an admirable exercise, even though I doubt that the person who put that sign up was what I would call a completely admirable or at least mature person. But that's the right idea. But yes, the second step, in my view, is to debate those ideas, discuss those ideas. One disagreement I have with Professor Shea is if you're looking for instant consensus, it's not going to happen. It never does. That's not how this liberal science or marketplace or whatever you want to call it works. It's also not about persuading the people with the worst ideas right then and there. What you're really trying to do is competing with each other to persuade the observers, those people out there who may have less of a stake in the argument, but who are willing to listen and be persuaded. That's what we did on same-sex marriage. I came up against extremists on the other side all the time, and they always pitched their arguments to the worst and craziest things that gay activists had said, and they always pitched their arguments to the true believers. Wrong. Pitch your argument to those quiet people in the room who are persuadable, and over time you do win them over. Here's another place where I might disagree with Professor Shea. I think he's arguing that the so-called marketplace of ideas just hasn't worked very well and that it's broken down where race is involved. I agree with him that race in America is a special case, even compared with, say, homosexuality, where the regime of naked repression, I mean, we're talking about people arrested in their bedroom, okay? The naked repression and oppression that went on was very severe and very recent. Race is unique in American life. I agree with that, and I agree with the comments he made about how deeply it's woven into American life. Here's the thing. If apart from gay rights, we have an example of the power of words and debate and appeal to reasoned conscience to turn things around, it would be on race in America. I'm not saying we're all the way there yet, but if there is one constant, if there are any anthropologists in the room, correct me if I'm wrong, if there is one constant in America, not in America, in human societies going back to primitive times, it would be tribalism and racism. It's how we're wired. The surprise is not that it's out there, the surprise is that we ever overcome it. And in race in America, I would argue that a critical moment, there are too many to say one is the critical moment, but a critical moment is not right up there with Brown versus Board of Education, maybe higher as New York Times versus Sullivan. That was when the Supreme Court said to the civil rights movement, you can make your case without getting shut up by being sued for libel by your opponents. That gave them their voice. And if you don't think Martin Luther King stating a moral proposition on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. You know the speech. I have a dream. You know that part. But you also remember the part where he restated the principles of the Declaration of Independence and gave reasons for it. It is a beautifully argued, reasoned, as well as lyrical speech. And if you look at America today compared with where it was when I was born in 1960, when segregation, the things Professor Shea talked about, were still rampant, you see a long way to go, yes, but you also see by the comparative annals of human history a fantastic moral journey. Where does moral learning come from? How do we get past the prejudices and bigotries which have shackled humans throughout time? I believe we do, in fact, get that through public criticism. Now, mind you, the stereotype that criticism is always polite, civil, scientific, orderly, well expressed is completely wrong. Even scientists often do it that way. Sociologists of science have looked into this and found that one of the best motivators for scientific inquiry is the desire to, and I quote, get that son of a bitch. I'm not saying that the people in the system need to have good motives, that they need to be disinterested, that they even need to be nice to each other. I'm saying that the system as a whole needs to allow them to float these ideas and then subject them to criticism, and that the reason is not in the individuals, it's in the system. Is it infallible in individual cases? Of course not. It turns out science was wrong about the speed of sound until about 20 years ago. Imagine that. I mean, people just forgot to check. When they checked, oops, wrong about the speed of sound. Lots of things we're wrong about today, but I would submit to you that at this university, some of the things that some of the people in this room are most certain about are things that they are in fact wrong about. And we don't know what they are yet. And that what we're calling for today's purpose, the marketplace of ideas, is not an ideal way to find those mistakes, but it is by far the best, and there is no functional alternative.
I'll begin by telling a story, one that really changed my life with a student that I had many years ago. And this kind of speaks to what we're talking about now, which is, what creates knowledge? Is it expression and ideas, or is it experience? And it doesn't have to be one or the other. It can be certainly a combination of both. One thing I didn't mention up here is that we often kind of see freedom of assembly as a speech, as a right that's kind of tacked on to the freedom of speech, right? Like the freedom of speech has a kind of primacy over the freedom of assembly, and the freedom of assembly could be thought of as kind of an autonomous right on its own, right? That's something that would be protected by the government as well, that would then lead to social good in the same way that the freedom of speech does. But here's the story. So I was teaching this graduate seminar, and it's about race and racism. Almost all my classes are about race and racism. And I was in my office, and during office hours, one of my students came in, and she's a non-traditional student. At that time, I think, if I had to guess, she was probably in her mid-40s. She was older than I was. And she kind of sat down, and I could tell that she had been having trouble in class with some of the concepts that we had been putting forward there. And she said, Dr. Shea, I just have to admit, I've never had a class before where we talk about race and racism like this. And it's been really difficult for me, as you can probably tell. And I just wanted to come in and talk to you about that so that we're on the same page in class. And I said, that's great. I really appreciate your coming to see me. And I said, you're not alone in that, right? And she said, it makes me really angry. And I thought, that's also not angry at me. I think, she was angry at something else. And I said, that's good. Do you know why you're angry? That you haven't had these conversations about race and racism in this way before. So I don't think I mentioned that she's a white woman, so a white woman in her mid-40s. And she said, I would have lived my life differently. And you know, every once in a while you have a moment in your career where a student changes everything for you. And that moment really did. You know, here's a student who was older than I was and revealed to me that her socialization as a white woman growing up in the upper Midwest, she had choices taken away from her for how to live her life. What to do for a living, what to stand up for, what to fight for, who to fall in love with, through no fault of her own, through a socialization and an institutionalization of ideas, right? So this expression, this marketplace of expression, this marketplace of ideas, had institutionally failed her. You know, where might knowledge have come from that would have given her the opportunity to make different decisions for how to live her life? Could they have come from experience? And so, you know, if I had to kind of sum up everything, you know, I want to say at this point, and maybe for the whole talk, it's that life is short. It's that it's difficult to say, wait for racial justice. That we'll eventually get there. Because what I hoped to have proved, or at least argued well, is that it happens in fits and starts. And it's, if it does happen, it's my guess that it won't be for a very long while, so long as we remain segregated as a society. Earlier this morning, Aaron had asked me, basically, what do you do about racism, Dr. Shea? And I kind of laughed. I said, are you really asking me to solve racism, Aaron? And I really did think about it, and you could do a whole lot worse than to talk about residential and educational segregation. You could do a whole lot worse than to spend your life fighting for integration on both of those fronts, and then changing the experiences that people have. That I think at my institution we tried to do with that Hmong learning community. But today, you know, I was speaking with some students at lunch. Okay, so I was speaking with some students at lunch about their experiences in high school and college. And I think that UVM is kind of similar to my institution for levels of racial diversity. And in many ways serving the region, even though I know that you draw nationally. So I asked students how would they feel about sending their, you know, if they chose to have families and they wanted to send their children to diverse schools, what level of diversity would be acceptable to them, right? And, you know, by and large, the statistics show that progressive white people, when they want to send their children to diverse schools, they want about 10% Black and Latino. When you hit 20%, the perception kind of kicks in that this might not be a quality school, that the learning might not be as good. Now, those progressive white people and Black and Latino parents, they want integrated schools for their children, but the numbers are completely different. So Black and Latino parents, I think, say that a diverse school would be 50 to 60%. That's what they would consider diverse. But it would be very rare to find a lot of white parents who would see a school that's, say, 60% Black and Latino and not have a kind of inkling that the quality of education at an institution like that is not quite as good as the one that they could get somewhere else. And this is one of the reasons why I see segregation as being such a central issue to this discussion that we're having. Because, you know, where the rubber meets the road and where your kid goes to school, despite whatever else you say about racial justice, in this country says a whole lot about which ideas will remain, which experiences will remain, which ones will be formative, and which ones will be absent. So life is short. That we have this struggle to fight, but we can't hold out for this hope that at the end of the line we will see the justice that we want. It's actually very liberating to admit that it's very possible that racism is permanent, but it doesn't change anything that you would do fighting against it. You would still fight for what is right, but you would also be released from a story that tells you that everything's going to be okay. So for me, this is one of the toughest lessons to give, and speaking only for myself, it's been extremely liberating. Thank you.
Just the next slide. Okay, well, thank you both for both your introductory comments and your responses. Before we start the question period, one announcement. We were able to hold this event in part because we got some funding from an organization called the Institute for Humane Studies. That organization would very much appreciate it if you could fill out an online survey at the website you see right there. So it's the ihs.org/UVM debate. So when you leave here, or write it down, or you could do it right now, but you could do it later too. I think they'll exclude yours. They know you. So please fill that out, and we would appreciate it, and so would the organization. For those of you who would like to ask questions, you can see there's a couple mics here, and just line up behind the mics, and we will alternate. So I see some very thin people behind the mics right now. If you do, if you would like to ask a question, please make it in the form of a question. Do not give a statement. Address your questions to either of the two speakers or to both of them. And we will have about a half an hour of Q&A. Anybody like to start?
Our work here is done. Let's eat. Just kidding, we just ate lunch.
The mics work? Anybody?
We wowed them into silence.
Yeah. Okay. One student.
Is it working? Yeah. All right. So you said that hate speech is basically derived from ignorance. So since we know that in the U.S., people generally live in their own localized echo chambers, what responsibility do you think the media has in ensuring that consumers of information have accurate and credible sources of information?
Addressed to both of us?
Either, anyone, both.
Right. Whoa. It's okay. This one works. So the question was responsibilities of the media to inform people better. As a card-carrying member of the media establishment, I'm an interested party, and I actually think that the amount of information out there is unprecedented, but the burden that we're placing on consumers to wade through that information is also unprecedented because of the social media and because of the collapse in trust in gatekeepers and in people like me. When I look at this issue and think about the echo chamber effect and the many ramifications that has for some of the points that we're talking about today, I actually tend to turn your question around a little bit, and I tend to think more in terms of what obligation does the consumer of news have to try to, before they repost something on Facebook or Twitter, try to ask themselves, so is that real news or is that fake news? Is that from a credible source or is that BS? I think we need to get better at teaching kids from junior high school on to understand the difference between real news and fake news, to understand where stuff is coming from. And another big part of what we've got to do is figure out how to clean up the act of some of the social media providers whose business model is repetition and echo. But I also think, I'm sorry to kind of turn your question around, it may seem unresponsive, but it's where I am on this, that a big part of this battle actually is on individual consumers to think before they hit that repost button.
Yeah, I agree with what Jonathan was saying. The only reason why I'm talking to you here today, I think, is that I wrote an article for NBR that a member of the Janus Forum liked and thought, you know, it would be good to invite me to talk with Jonathan today. And so my career's kind of evolved since I started teaching, and now I really believe that it's vitally important for people like me, scholars, particularly those of us who write about race and racism, to be able to speak to the public, to be able to write in a jargon-free way that can explain complex ideas to the public. And I'm not super optimistic that we've turned any kind of corner about this, because I think one of the reasons why we're in the dire straits that we are today is that there's just deep confusion about these very common concepts that I was referencing in my presentation. What does white mean? What is racism? You know, if I asked the people in the room to define institutional racism, I might get, 20 different answers. So the reason why the media seems to be contributing to the problem is that I think there's also this absence of a firm idea on these terms, and I think that sometimes people who are part of the profession almost willfully manipulate the confusion that the public has over the meanings of those terms to generate a firestorm. Thank you.
Hi. I have a non-race related question. So, very localized. On this campus right now, there's a program called the Wellness Environment, where they have a certain rule where the whole general idea is to be healthy and exercise, eat well, stay drug-free, alcohol-free, and there's an effective ban within that dorm unit of clothes like marijuana socks, or like a shirt. A girl was told not to wear a shirt that said gin and juice, which is like a Snoop Dogg album. So I was wondering what the merits to preventing kids from wearing clothes as free speech. Is that protection? Is that protected speech? Is that a system that could work to help further the discussion of being healthy, and is that free speech?
If you'll forgive putting you on the spot, I'm curious, what's your feeling about that?
Well, I came to this school, it was very, very libertarian when I came here. Liberal libertarian. There were kids smoking pot like all over the place, and I'm not going to say it's a bad thing that they stopped, but there's been a smoking ban. The school's gotten a little bit more professional, and I think all that is generally good. We're getting nice buildings, we're getting better facilities, we're getting better faculty, but I don't think that we should be going as far as banning students from wearing clothing on campus, because that was one of the main tenets of the freedom that I experienced when I first got here.
Is this practice that you described to us controversial on campus?
Yes.
So in this room, are people familiar with this? A lot of heads going negative.
Is it just in a residence hall, or is it campus-wide?
So the single residence hall, the big nice new one right here on campus, is where they're doing most of this clothing ban. And the ultimate problem I see with it is that most of the new freshman students are funneled through these dorms. They don't really even know that there's an alternative, so they all wind up in an anti-free speech.
So they're not selecting this environment because that's where they've looked at the options and they've decided this is the environment they prefer.
Yeah, it's like it's a 900 student dorm or something, and they basically just tell everyone this is the way it is here. Come on in. it's being looked at as an experiment, I hear, by a lot of other campuses, and I think it's a great experiment, and I think it should be tried out a lot of places, but perhaps without the clothing ban rule.
Well, this is very interesting on several levels. The Supreme Court is going to hear a case. It's a clothing ban that a number of states have on what you can wear when you go to vote. Because a lot of states have rules saying that you can't show up at the polling place with any political messages on your attire, and their states are interpreting that very, very broadly. So like a picture of an elephant could be interpreted that way. And there's right now, so this very issue, or a version of it, is about to head to the Supreme Court. My take on this is that, particularly if it's not an opt-in environment, but even if it is, the behavior you're describing is very likely unconstitutional. This is a state school. You're not allowed in government institutions to discriminate based on viewpoint. You can have guidelines about how people can dress that apply broadly. But you can't say, for example, no Democratic t-shirts, only Republican t-shirts, and therefore you can't say no pro-marijuana t-shirts, only anti-marijuana t-shirts. So I think that this experiment would not be looked kindly on by the courts. I also kind of doubt it's that effective. You know, I'm not sure about that, but I don't know if suppressing the messages and getting people to change their socks is really the best way to change attitudes toward the use of substance on campus. And we're getting off on a tangent, but I've always felt that the age 21 drinking age was counterproductive because it meant that students couldn't have a supervised, responsible environment to drink. So just suppressing the symptoms doesn't usually work. So that would be my take. Do you have a view on this? I mean, you're an actual academic in an actual university community, which I'm not.
Where does the directive come from? Is it from the Dean of Students, the Student Affairs head?
So Dr. Jim Hudziak he's the big wellness guy, and basically he laid out the idea that these symbols are effectively triggers. He uses the word neural triggers. So
okay.
The idea that if you
like you want to smoke pot if you see a marijuana leaf on a t-shirt?
Neural triggers.
Yeah. So the idea is if someone's wearing a beer can on their shirt, then unlike walking by the numerous bars down on Church Street or something, you will suddenly be unsafe in your own.
God forbid you should watch the Super Bowl.
Is marijuana legal in Vermont or not?
Starting in July.
Okay. So maybe the policy will change a little bit, but I mean, is there like a ban on T-shirts for Mountain Dew, which is probably worse for you than pot is?
Nope.
So it's just right for now an illegal substance.
Yes.
I agree with Jonathan. It's unconstitutional.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. It's an interesting case.
So my question is for David, and you discussed the desirability of diversity for schools for progressive whites.
Mm-hmm.
And do you think that is race-based or more a realization of the economic reality of those races?
When you say, could you clarify what you mean by the economic reality of those races?
The average black family and the average Latino family is poor, which means less tax dollars going into the school district.
Right. That absolutely is going to play a role in certain measures that we use to judge the quality of a school, right? Given that property tax values kind of feed into the wealth or lack of it in schools, that's going to affect, I don't know, how many AP courses you have, right? How many teachers with master's degrees that you have to teach those courses. But here's the point, which is that very often you can point to those kinds of things and say, I just want my kid to have the greatest opportunity for learning. So it's not about race. It's just that I want to go to the school with the most AP courses and that has the best reputation. And integration is not going to come without costs, right? But I think too often those costs get rationalized away by talking about things like having the best opportunity for success. Especially when the people making those decisions know that in that one case, there would be a delay toward a future that they would probably want, right? A more integrated future, more racial justice. And so that's what I mean when I say the rubber meets the road. That, you know, the decision that you make for your kid about where they go to school says a lot about the future of racism in this country, right? I don't know if racism is permanent. I can entertain the idea that it is, but if something like that continues and people continue to say, oh, it's not about race at all, it's just about getting the highest quality education, then I'm more inclined to believe that it is permanent.
Right, but so you're saying that it's race-based, essentially. I mean,
not on the surface. I think a lot of these decisions and a lot of these rationalizations happen at an unconscious level, and that they're also kind of socialized, where you have a particular cohort that would reinforce those beliefs and kind of reassure you that it's the right thing to do to send your kid to this school rather than that school.
so how do you get around the race aspect of it?
Yeah.
And then the economic reality of it?
I mean, I would ask you, do you, would you rather your kid go and, I'm just making a huge assumption about you here, but let's just say down the road you want to have kids, what would be more important to you would be for your kid to go to a school that's 50 to 60% Black and Latino, or to have access to every AP course in existence, and to have, that high school send most of its graduates to prestigious universities. What's better for your child? That is, I'm really kind of asking, what kind of person do you hope your child will be, right? And those two things don't have to be mutually exclusive. You can get a very high quality education with these much more diverse schools, but the perception is so strong that it's not going to happen. The perception is so strong that your kid's going to get kind of drawn into the wrong crowd, that it really tips the scales in that one direction. I don't know, Jonathan, if you wanted to.
Well, I'll just make a few quick points, but they'll actually be directed more to you, David, than to the questioner, but it's an opportunity to make a couple points. The first is that segregation and racism are huge problems in America, but it's hard for me to see how you figure out what the best policies to deal with that are going to be and how to build some sort of actionable consensus about that if you can't discuss them. So I think the regime that I'm talking about, which is open discussion, even of very difficult topics, and taking people seriously, or at least allowing them to be heard, even if they have obnoxious things to say, is part of the solutions to the problems that you laid out. One difference I have with a lot of academics is they seem to assume we already know the answers and that it's just a question of, we should be there now. I don't assume we have the answers. There's a huge problem with residential segregation and school segregation in America. If I'm not mistaken, public schools are more segregated than private schools in this country, but it's because of housing patterns. And there are a lot of people who say very credibly that if you want to solve that problem, the first thing you have to do are school vouchers, so that where people send their kids to school is no longer dictated by where they live, so you don't have the huge home prices in Montgomery County because everyone wants to go to that school and only rich people can afford it. The point I'm making is, of course, a lot of progressives hate the idea of vouchers. We're going to have to talk this out. We don't know the answers yet. We don't even know for sure yet, as you say, what the difference is between racism and other economic factors. And people who, they're just hardworking people and want the best education for their kids, and I'm reluctant to call them racist. So what I'm saying at the end of the day is that there are no shortcuts around this critical process that I talk about, even if, I would argue, especially if you agree with Professor Shea about the very fraught nature of race in America today.
Just one other thing, that there can be policy solutions to this. I think school choice is one that has been floated. I think you can talk about ways that actually increases segregation in the country. I would recommend Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law, and he actually offers some solutions, which would be things like integrating neighborhoods by reducing mortgage tax for people who would diversify a neighborhood. These really kind of clear but very difficult and probably quite unpopular policy issues. So integration, as I said, is not going to come without a cost. And, you know, I'm not so certain that it's just going to be this kind of clash of ideas that will help us arrive at a truthful and just answer.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
So this question is directed towards both of you. Professor Shea, in your presentation, you showed us the poster that people put up on for the Hmong group, and it was anonymous. So I'm wondering how both of you view the ease of anonymity in the free speech debate and how that factors into the marketplace of ideas or the marketplace of experiences.
Sure. From the beginning, and I should say that by and large, the Hmong American students who said that they were offended and hurt by the messages on this poster didn't want any punishment for the people. I mean, any kind of expulsion, right, for the people who were responsible for it. What they asked for was an institutional response. But the institution, their first response was to find out, you know, who was responsible for it, right, and then deal with the situation that way. But the students themselves said, you know, this is part of a larger problem. Can we have a larger discussion about racism on our campus? Can we have a discussion about anti-Hmong attitudes on our campus? And so in some ways, the fact that the people who put up the poster were anonymous kind of pushed the dialogue toward an institutional response and away from a response that I think was just too easy and that didn't really get to the root of the problem, which is, you know, what are the practices that we have on this campus that might contribute to, I guess, the sense of entitlement about, you know, your place at the university versus what other people deserve.
I have complicated feelings about anonymity recently. I didn't used to. There's a famous Supreme Court decision which protected the ability of the NAACP to protect the anonymity of its donors. One of the things that segregationists tried to do to stop the NAACP was demand that all the names of their donors be released to the public. And you can imagine what would have happened to some of those people, especially in some of the communities where they were white and in the South. The Supreme Court said, no, anonymity is part of the free speech right in political debate. You don't have to get exposed every time you give to a group. I always thought that was the right decision. I'm in the process of trying to understand what I think about the anonymity idea, and you can guess why. It's because of the terrible antisocial behavior that we're seeing in the internet world. We know that anonymity drives that. We know that people behave much worse when they're anonymous, when they don't have to face the actual shame of being confronted with the things that they've said that are hurtful or incorrect. And even more to the point, we also know that in a world shielded by anonymity, you can be a robot. You're not human at all. And we don't, something that we really don't have any precedent for thinking about is free speech or a marketplace of ideas or a marketplace of persuasion in which a lot of the seeming participants are in fact computer programs, sometimes put there by foreign governments in order to undermine your democracy. I'm having a serious rethink about anonymity, and frankly, I'd be kidding you if I knew the answer. Is that part of where your question is coming from, this
That's a
internet
fantastic
stuff?
answer to it. Yeah.
Well, I mean, your generation's going to have to figure this out. This has got to be one of the toughest questions out there.
Thank you very much.
Go to law school if you're not there already and figure out the doctrine on anonymity.
Yeah, isn't it weird that the Twitter CEOs have to figure this out rather than our elected representatives, right?
Hello, my question is for you.
Yeah.
Can I start this with like a little short statement that I think sets up the context for the question?
Yeah.
So your position on placing limitations on speech appears to be contingent on your particular agreement with both the authority figures who are writing the speech regulation policy and those enforcing the policy. Why do you seem to assume that both of those individuals' agreement is going to lie with you? And also, you seem to have an issue with institutions wielding power against minority groups. But how can you assure that once the speech code is enshrined, it won't be wielded against those who you wish to protect? If an authority figure who you believe is wrong gets into power?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for the questions. I'll answer the second one first. And I think, you know, like Jonathan was saying, you know, your ideas about anonymity might be shifting a little bit given, you know, what's just happened in the last couple of years. You know, my attitudes toward free expression and free speech, which, just to clarify again, are probably very similar to Jonathan's. You know, I believe that there should be restrictions for harassment and what is called true threats. I also believe that there's a difference between what happens in the classroom, which is governed by academic freedom, and what might happen on other parts of the campus, which would allow for a more kind of free-form, robust discussion, that there are certain standards within the classroom that I'm more than happy to uphold, so that you know, we can give everybody their right to an education who's in that room. But as far as you know, not being so sure that speech restrictions will then be turned upon minority groups. First of all, you know, I'm not advocating for speech restrictions other than the ones I've just mentioned to you. I'm actually against speech codes. My reasons might be different from Jonathan's. I think they sometimes substitute for substantive action. That is, rather than diversifying a campus or diversifying a faculty, you have a speech code. At some point, you know, we have to talk about what really matters. The ability to talk about something or the ability to enact something. That sometimes we get so caught up in our right to say something or not say something that we kind of forget why we're talking in the first place. And that's what I was trying to suggest here, that maybe one way that we move away from the marketplace of ideas is that we take kind of a lot of the burden off of speech, and we actually say, what might the state be able to do to enact what these people are talking about, right? So when people say, your speech hurts me, they're saying that your speech is an act. Well, what other kind of act could the state then help these particular groups who are talking about hate speech? But to get back to your question about kind of flipping things on its head, I would just say something that I wrote about in that article. That I think it was Charles Lawrence who said that, you know, all of those students who were fighting for free speech, they really weren't heard until they exceeded the bounds of free speech, right? So when people say, well, you're gonna want that day, you know, if that day ever comes, you're gonna want those free speech protections that you seem so ready to discard right now. Well, the people who were fighting for those, you know, for free speech got arrested. They exceeded the bounds of free speech, right? So they weren't protected within the boundaries of those of that free speech. Now, all that said, I would much rather have those protections than not have them. But one of the things that's changing my opinion, that's kind of shifting my beliefs on this, is what's happening right now, what you're describing, which is because of this confusion about what racial identity is, what white racial identity is, there are lots of students and faculty who are simply targeted by the anonymous Twitter users that we were talking about. And a lot of these, because a lot of institutions are unprepared to deal with these abuses of free speech, right? Rather than protect the free speech of their faculty and staff, they suspend them, they put them on leave, right? And sometimes even fire them, right? So their free speech is abridged because of this, this confusion. So that's one reason why my belief in free expression being curtailed only by these cases of harassment and true threats is what it is, because I'm actually seeing what you're describing. I don't know whether the free speech protections will bring justice. As I've said to you, a number of faculty across the country have been punished for their free speech. But as I said earlier, it's better to have those protections than not have them.
Thank you.
Thank you.
In the interest of keeping on schedule, we'll have one more question.
So this one is for you, Professor Shea. And I guess when you were speaking to that gentleman before about like where would he choose to school his kids, or I was thinking about like the idea that there are multiple conceptions of racial justice. Like I was thinking like if I get my graduate degree from the counseling program, like God willing, that maybe like I would have to make that choice. But like that, the concept of gentrifying and pricing people out of a neighborhood, if I have a graduate degree, like competes with desiring, like, and I actually agree with you, like I would desire my kids to go to a more diverse school as well. So it's not that and I'm also thinking about like the start, like Brown versus Board of Education, which Jonathan mentioned, like at that time, if I was like in that moment, I would like to think that I would have supported integration, but I know that integration also failed people of color quite a bit. Like they lost black role models in schools, and black people felt like, black teachers were kicked out of schools rather than integrated. So it actually was like an educational failure for black students. And so I guess what I'm asking is like, how do you like parse that line, like in the fight for equity about, and I think this is like, I feel like politically I agree with you, and then like speech-wise I agree with Jonathan, and I'm kind of asking how you like, right, right. So how do you parse those ideas, I guess, if you know what I'm saying? Like, because I think there's a lot of competing conceptions of what is just, and we see they play out differently with like the institutional racism of kicking black teachers out of white, like integrated schools,
Mm-hmm. Could you repeat the question one more time?
Sure. So like when, like, because I guess I'm saying like how, if we're interested in equity, like how do you parse, like even like his, like if that's that person who was speaking before would have like sent his children to the better school, like how do we parse the quality of ideas, which I think is what Jonathan's whole like way of thinking is kind of about, like, because like I'm not convinced that sending, like, although that's what I would be feel compelled to do, I'm not convinced that I would be right, because then maybe I'd be again like pushing that gentrification like curve, So I'm saying like in your life and in your work, how do you parse the like the conflictual ideas in your field or thinking?
So are you talking about kind of the conflict of wanting a particular experience versus this kind of robust debate of ideas?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. Maybe it's a more like, maybe I haven't like defined the question very well. Yeah. I guess I'm. Yeah. If you have anything to say about it, I guess.
No. I just was trying to get a little clarity on the question, and I would say that you would think that segregated neighborhoods lead to segregated schools, but we're starting to see a transition where here we're talking about white progressives again, right? They are absolutely down with living in communities that are much more diverse than the schools. right? So that when it comes to living in a community like Brooklyn, for instance,
Sure.
you will have much greater diversity than you would in certain schools. So there's a difference between being okay with living your life and your children's life in a particular community and where you send them to school. And all I'm trying to say is that that's a kind of dissonance that we need to talk about.
Right.
Like there's something there that we really do need to discuss further.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Before we end, we have a little token of appreciation. I have my gift giver is bringing the gifts. Wow. For John and David.
Thank you.
So thank you both for coming here. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for asking some great questions. And if you'd like to continue the conversation outside the doorways where we have the reception, we'll be all around here for a few minutes or for a while. And we hope to see all of you next fall at our next Janus event, whatever that is about. Thank you.